Okay, starting on a new topic, and probably one of the more interesting and challenging ones in anatomy. It's definitely going to be, it's going to use quite a bit of your time to understand this, but we're going to start talking about muscles and muscle actions. That's what I want to do in this video, is introduce you to sort of how muscles move things around in the big picture, and then we'll get to the microscopic stuff a little bit later. So to help you with what you're going to be doing in lab, first off, in the last two labs, you learned skeletal system, and you learned skeletal system, like the features of the skeletal system. Here's a tiny skeleton. I don't know if you have access to one of these, but when you are looking and you learned, for instance, the deltoid tuberosity of the left humerus right here, now what we're going to be doing is we're going to start attaching muscles to the skeletal system and show you how those muscle attachments with the skeletal system will result in body movements. So before we get into the specifics of body movements, let's do the big picture. Generally speaking, when you are talking about a muscle, muscles are going to be attached to, quite often, the skeletal system, although not all muscles attach to the skeletal system, but let's just stick with that for now. Muscles are going to be attached to the skeletal system, let's say, at 2 points. One of those points is going to be called the origin, right here. Or if you're dealing with the appendicular skeleton, it can be referred to as the proximal attachment. And then there's going to be an insertion. And the insertion, if you're dealing with the appendicular skeleton, could be the distal attachment. Again, you don't use proximal and distal when you're talking about the trunk or the head, but you do use it along the lengths of the limbs or tubes. So let's talk about origins and insertions and what they have to do with muscle movements. So generally speaking, when the muscle contracts here, the origin is going to stay relatively stationary, and the insertion is going to move, and it's going to move in a pretty dependable way. So this is the fixed or immovable point of attachment, and this is the movable point of attachment. Now, one of the things you need to know about muscles is that muscles only pull, they never push. So what a muscle can do, for instance, is it can contract. And since the origin is stationary and the insertion is movable, what it's going to do when it contracts is move the insertion closer to the origin. So muscles only pull, they never push. Therefore, let's look at this model that we have here. Let's see how well you guys can see this. This is like a simplified muscle diagram. And in this muscle diagram, I'll try to bring it to class if I can once we get into muscles. What's going to happen is the rubber band is actually representing, of course, a muscle. And then these little, what the heck do you call those? Those little pokey outy things, those little knobs, represent attachment points. But for each one that we hook it up to, one's going to be an origin and one's going to be an insertion. So this one is immovable, and when I attach it to this one and then I let it contract, it will move. Okay, so in this one, this top particular muscle, this top attachment point right here is going to be which? Is that the origin or the insertion for this muscle? This one stays stationary upon contraction, and this one moves closer to the origin upon contraction. Okay, so this is the origin and this is the insertion for this muscle. But one of the things that's also really important for you to understand is that since muscles only pull, they never push, if I want for the joint to be able to do the opposite thing, what I'm probably going to have to do is to put a muscle on the other side of the joint. So that's a different origin, and then I'm going to go down and I'm going to have a different insertion so that the muscle, when it contracts, will be able to do the opposite thing. So if I put both of them on, okay, Here's the origin and here's the insertion for this muscle. Let's say this is the biceps brachii. When I allow that one to contract, that is the action because this insertion moves closer to that origin, okay? But if I want it to be able to do the opposite thing, okay, what I will do is contract the muscle on the opposite side of the joint, which is the triceps brachii. Let's let the biceps go for a minute, and it will do the opposite action, okay? So, muscles, in order to get a muscle to do two opposite actions around the same joint, you're going to have to pair the muscles around the joint. So this muscle right here that we're seeing in this figure, this is the biceps brachii. When this one contracts, it will do that action, right? But in order to get it to do the opposite action, we're going to have to strap a muscle on the other side of this joint and contract that one. So muscles are arranged in what we call opposing or sometimes antagonistic pairs. And so if you're talking about an action, let's go back to the original one like this. The muscle that does this action, you would call the agonist. The muscle that does the opposite of this action, the one on the other side of the joint, you would call the antagonist, as in opposite of. And if this muscle right here, ouch, if this muscle has a helper, sometimes there's more than one muscle that does the action. If it has a helper that goes from like here to here, that might be the synergist. A synergist will help the prime mover or the agonist. And sometimes there's more than one muscle. And for this one, there actually are. There's the biceps brachii that does this action you're seeing right here. But then there's also a muscle that's deep in here called the brachialis, and those help one another. Okay, so there is a colleague of mine made this great stop motion intro about muscle terminology. And since we're not as in person as we generally are, this thing's kind of fantastic. So she will go through the different muscle actions and how the muscles work in general, the attachment points. So types of muscle movements, attachment points. It's with this cool little mannequin that she does in stop motion animation. It's very awesome. So that's linked for you. All right. So that's the intro to how muscles work. And then what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to start talking about specific body movements that correlate to what we call muscle actions. Okay. So this is going to be putting skeletal system and muscular system together with these actions.